When we speak about dark psychology, we need to understand that its foundation isn't brute force or obvious control. It doesn't begin with chains or commands. It begins with perception. Perception is the lens through which every single one of us interprets reality. And here's the truth. We don't respond to reality as it is. We respond to reality as we perceive it. The story we tell ourselves about an event is often more powerful than the event itself. A manipulator understands this fact deeply, and that's why their first move is always to frame how you see. Think about it. Two people can experience the exact same situation, yet walk away with entirely different interpretations. One sees betrayal, another sees opportunity. One sees chaos, another sees freedom. Reality is stable, but perception is malleable. It bends, it shifts, it can be redirected. And once someone learns how to shape another person's perception, they gain leverage not just over what that person thinks, but over what they feel and ultimately how they act. That's what makes perception so dangerous in the hands of someone who understands dark psychology. They don't need to lie outright. They don't even need to change all of the facts. They only need to present reality in a way that leads you to interpret it differently. That is manipulation at its most refined. It isn't about brute distortion. It's about selective framing. They highlight what benefits them. They omit what harms them. And suddenly you are making conclusions that you think are your own, when in reality, they were planted. History is full of examples. Propagandists have always known this. They don't just tell you what's happening, they tell you what it means. They provide the lens through which you interpret the facts. That is why entire nations can be mobilized, not because people see reality clearly, but because their perception has been shaped to fit a narrative. And this same principle that governs politics and mass movements also plays out in the intimacy of personal relationships. Take the example of a toxic partner. They may do something obviously harmful, betray you, insult you, dismiss your feelings. But when you confront them, they shift the frame. They tell you that you're being too sensitive, that you misunderstood, that what you saw wasn't what you thought it was. Over time, this warps your perception. You begin to doubt your instincts. You begin to second-guess your own lens. And once you're uncertain about your perception, you are far easier to control. Because if you can't trust your own eyes, your own interpretation, you'll rely on theirs. And that dependence, that's the foundation of psychological control. This is why manipulators are often charming. Charm is not sincerity. It's a tool for shaping perception. If you feel disarmed, if you feel seen, if you feel flattered, then your perception of that person softens, and you become more susceptible to their framing of reality. Charm creates a window of trust, and through that window, they pour their narrative. Once you've accepted their frame, they no longer have to push you, but let's go deeper here, because there's a philosophical dimension you believe it is your own choice. The question isn't just how do others manipulate our perception? The deeper question is why are we so vulnerable to it? And the answer is that human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We cannot tolerate chaos. We need a story that organizes our experience, and the manipulator knows this. They supply the story. They say, here is why this is happening. Here is what it means. Here is how you should feel. And because we crave certainty, because we want order in the face of confusion, we accept the narrative. Now, of course, not every story is manipulation, but the dividing line is intent. When someone provides a narrative that serves truth and growth, that's guidance. But when they provide a narrative that serves only themselves at the expense of your clarity, that's manipulation. And time, if you're paying attention, always exposes the difference. So what do? We become conscious of our own lens. We become skeptical of narratives that come too easily, too neatly packaged, too emotionally charged. We ask ourselves, whose interest does this perception serve? We train ourselves to see not just what is presented, but what is omitted. That awareness, seeing the frame itself, is what breaks the spell. Because once you understand that perception is not reality but a lens through which reality is interpreted, you gain back your power. You can question, you can resist, you can refuse to outsource your vision of the world to someone else, and that's the beginning of freedom. So remember this, manipulation doesn't begin with control of your body, it begins with control of your perception. If someone can dictate how you see, they don't need to chain your hands. They already have your mind. And the only true defense is awareness, to recognize the lens being placed before you and to choose to see for yourself. The power of perception is the power to shape reality in the mind. If you surrender that lens to someone else, you surrender your freedom. But if you guard it, if you question it, if you learn to see with your own eyes, you break the spell. And once you break the spell, no manipulator can own you. If perception is the doorway into manipulation, emotion is the engine that drives it forward. Because once someone has shaped how you see, the next step is to use what you feel. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Our emotions, while profoundly human, can be used against us if we are unaware. A skilled manipulator doesn't fight your feelings. They ride them, they amplify them, they twist them until the very things that make you human become the very things that trap you. Think for a moment about fear. Fear is one of the most primal emotions we have. It's designed to protect us from danger. But what happens when someone learns to trigger fear in you selectively? They don't need to lock you in a cage. They only need to make you afraid of stepping out of the one you build in your own mind. This is how abusive leaders hold on to power, how toxic partners maintain control, how even corporations and institutions sometimes manipulate people by shaping what they fear and when they feel it. Fear becomes a leash, invisible but powerful, but fear is only one side of the equation. Guilt is another. A manipulator understands that guilt can be heavier than chains because it doesn't just stop your actions, it makes you punish yourself. Narcissists, for example, are experts at weaponizing guilt. They convince you that standing up for yourself is selfish, that saying no is cruel, that your pain is somehow your fault. And once you accept that narrative, you no longer need them to control you. You control yourself on their behalf. That is the subtle genius of emotional exploitation. The victim begins to police their own freedom. And then there is love. Love is the most profound and life-giving emotion we have, but it is not immune to manipulation. In fact, in many ways, it is the most dangerous tool in the manipulator's arsenal. Because when love is distorted, it blinds us. This is why so many people stay in toxic relationships far longer than they should. They believe that loyalty is virtue, even when loyalty is being abused. They confuse intermittent affection with genuine care. They tell themselves stories to preserve the bond, even when the bond is eroding their spirit. Love becomes the chain, and the manipulator knows exactly how to tighten it just enough to keep you close, while loosening it occasionally so you believe you are free. The brilliance of this exploitation lies in its invisibility. Most people think manipulation will look obvious, like a puppet master pulling strings, but it doesn't. It looks like your own emotions. You don't feel like you're being controlled. You feel like you're simply reacting to what's happening. But what's happening has been orchestrated to create those reactions. And that is why it's so hard to see in the moment. This is why the aftermath of manipulation is often so devastating. It's not just the betrayal of trust. It's the realization that your own feelings were turned against you. That the very things that made you human, fear, guilt, love, were not honored but exploited. And that realization can leave a person questioning not just others but themselves. How could I not see it? How could I be so blind? But this self-blame misses the point. The truth is the manipulator was skilled. They studied your patterns. They found your openings. They used your own empathy, your own loyalty, your own desire to connect as leverage. That isn't a weakness, it's proof of your humanity. But once you understand this dynamic, you are no longer powerless, because awareness transforms the equation. When you know that fear can be used against you, you pause before surrendering to it. When you recognize guilt being imposed unfairly, you question its legitimacy. When you see love being twisted into a trap, you remind yourself that love without respect is not love at all. It is control dressed in sentiment. And this is where the deeper transformation happens. You don't need to become cold to protect yourself. You don't need to kill your emotions. That would be surrendering the very essence of your humanity to the manipulator. The real answer is to feel with clarity, to keep your empathy but add discernment, to allow love but only where it is reciprocated, to honor guilt but only when it reflects real responsibility, not manufactured obligation, to respect fear but only when it points to actual danger, not imagined shadows cast by someone else's games. This is how emotional not because you shut yourself off, but because you grow wise enough to see through the tricks. You stop being someone who can be easily pulled in 10 directions by every flicker of feeling, and you start becoming someone anchored, aware, steady, difficult to move without your consent. And when you reach that point, something powerful happens. The manipulator loses interest. Why? Because manipulation requires response. If you are no longer easily provoked, if your emotions are no longer their tools, they cannot play the game. You are no longer prey. You are untouchable. So the lesson here is simple but profound. Your emotions are not your enemies. They are your compass, your fuel, your connection to life. But like any powerful force, they can be hijacked if you don't know how they work. Once you see how fear can be manufactured, how guilt can be planted, how love can be twisted, you stop being surprised. And when you stop being surprised, you stop being controlled. And that's where strength is born. Not in abandoning your feelings, but in mastering them. Not in being unfeeling, but in being unshakable. Because when your emotions belong fully to you, no manipulator, no narcissist, no psychopath can turn them into chains. One of the most dangerous elements of manipulation is not just what it does to your emotions or your perceptions, but the illusion of control it creates. Because the truth is, when people are trapped in toxic dynamics, whether with a narcissist, a psychopath, or simply a manipulative person, they often believe they are still in charge of their own choices. They think they're exercising free will. They think they're deciding when to stay, when to forgive, when to comply. But in reality, the boundaries of their choices have been drawn for them carefully, invisibly, by someone else. This is the genius of the illusion. It doesn't feel like chains, it feels like freedom. You believe you're choosing, but every option has already been narrowed, guided, and shaped to serve the manipulator's end. That's why people can stay stuck for years, convinced they're acting out of loyalty, love, or reason, when in fact they are responding to conditions carefully engineered to keep them in place. You consider the dynamic of intermittent reinforcement, a psychological tactic that's as old as human behavior itself. The manipulator gives just enough reward, affection, attention, validation to keep you invested, but never enough to satisfy you fully. It's like a gambler at a slot machine. You keep pulling the lever, not because you always win, but because you might, and that might is enough to keep you hooked. You tell yourself you're staying because of love, or because of commitment, or because things will change. But really, you're staying because the cycle has conditioned your brain to crave the unpredictable hit of reward. That's not freedom, that's programming. And this doesn't only happen in personal relationships. It happens in workplaces where toxic bosses alternate between praise and humiliation, keeping employees on edge but invested. It happens in political systems where leaders sow chaos, then present themselves as the only solution, trapping citizens in dependence, It happens in friendships, families, communities, anywhere someone seeks to dominate without appearing to. The illusion is maintained because the manipulator knows how much humans need coherence. We need to believe our choices make sense. We need to believe we're not trapped. So they exploit that need by creating a framework that feels rational even when it isn't. They'll tell you, you can leave if you want, but you'll never find someone who cares like I do. Or you're free to make your own decisions, but remember how much I've done for you. The language is permissive, but the undertone is threatening. You're free, but only within the box they've built. Breaking free from this illusion requires a painful but necessary act, recognizing that much of what felt like your own choice was actually shaped by another's hand. And that realization is humbling. It challenges the ego because nobody wants to admit they've been played. But humility is the price of freedom. You can't escape a prison you won't admit you're in. But here's the paradox. Once you see the illusion for what it is, once you admit that your so-called freedom was actually managed, which you reclaim something infinitely more powerful, genuine choice. Suddenly the walls of the box become visible, and when they are visible, you can step outside. The manipulator loses their advantage because their entire game depends on you believing the game doesn't exist. Awareness destroys illusion. Now, this is where the lesson becomes even deeper. It's not enough to simply leave the manipulator's grasp. Because if you don't understand how the illusion was constructed, you're vulnerable to falling into another one. That's why people often repeat toxic patterns in different relationships, different jobs, different settings. The actors change, but the play stays the same. They escape one manipulator only to fall under the sway of another. Why? Because the illusion feels familiar. And familiarity to the human psyche feels like safety, even when it's dangerous. So the work is not just escape. It is education. It is training your mind to notice the subtle tricks, the half-truths framed as kindness, the shifting of blame disguised as concern, the freedom that exists only on someone else's terms. It's developing the ability to pause and ask, is this choice really mine? Or was it built for me by someone else? That single question can dismantle entire structures of control. And here lies the empowering truth. Manipulators can only build illusions. They cannot actually control you, not in the deepest sense. They cannot own your will unless you surrender it. They cannot dictate your freedom unless you believe their story about what freedom is. Their power is borrowed from your assumptions, your fears, your blind spots. And once you stop lending them that power, their castle crumbles. This is why time, awareness, and reflection are so essential. Time reveals patterns that single moments conceal. Awareness dismantles the illusion. Reflection restores agency. And once agency is restored, the manipulator's grip fades into irrelevance. So remember this, the most dangerous trap is not the one with visible walls, but the one disguised as freedom. The most effective prison is the one where the prisoner doesn't know they're confined. And the most powerful act of liberation is not running from chains, but recognizing that the chains were never real to begin with. Because when you see through the illusion of control, when you reclaim your choices as truly your own, you don't just escape the manipulator, you transcend them.